The air was heavy with silence on the Tunisian coast in September 1943. Italian officers, once symbols of Mussolini's ambition, now stood in neat but trembling rows, their boots coated in dust, their eyes lowered toward the weapons in their hands. The order had come surrender everything, to many of them. That simple command felt like the final stroke of humiliation. Their swords, polished steel, once raised in parades before cheering crowds in Rome, were now reduced to nothing more than offerings of defeat. Hands shook as blades were presented, not to comrades in ceremony, but to the very enemy they had been trained to hate in that moment. More than 1,000 years of imagined Roman honor seemed to dissolve into the desert air. Some officers whispered to each other, recalling how Mussolini himself had boasted of empire restored, of Mediterranean dominance. Now, those same promises turned to dust at Cape Bon. Captain Luigi Ricci, a career officer of 39, later wrote in a diary smuggled from the camp, "I felt my hand betray me when I loosened my sword. I was no longer a soldier, only a man stripped bare in front of foreigners." Yet the expected jeers never came. No American soldier spat on the ground, no British guard mocked their shame. Instead, silence ruled the exchange. When Major John Whitaker of the U.S. Army stepped forward to accept Ricci's sword, he merely nodded once, firmly but without cruelty. The absence of ridicule was so sharp it cut deeper than words. Officers exchanged bewildered glances. Humiliation had been anticipated, even welcomed as fitting punishment. But this quiet acknowledgement left them adrift, uncertain how to process the dignity being returned to them. Behind them, columns of Italian troops shuffled nervously, their uniforms sagging from exhaustion, their eyes darting to the rifles of American guards. They braced for brutality, remembering stories of how prisoners back in Italy were left to starve, how even their own people had treated captives with disdain. The desert wind carried the echo of their fears. Yet instead of rage, the camp gates opened to something unexpected. The numbers told a story larger than any single man. Nearly 600,000 Italians would be captured during the war, with over 50,000 transported to the United States itself. This was not a handful of officers caught in misfortune, it was an empire's military dignity unraveling. Still, in this opening moment at Cape Bon, the paradox revealed itself. Disgrace was expected, yet fragments of respect survived. As the sun lowered into the horizon, the scene looked almost ceremonial, though stripped of grandeur. The sound of swords clinking onto wooden tables carried like funeral bells, each note a farewell to illusions of power. Yet within that somber ritual lay the first seed of a revelation that defeat, though crushing, did not demand the destruction of one's humanity. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. The surrender was only the beginning for the Italian officers who once strutted beneath Mussolini's banners. The true test began in the hours and days that followed, after the silence at Cape Bon. They were marched under guard through the dusty roads, boots dragging, uniforms still intact but spirits fractured. Many expected the next phase to be the true humiliation mockery, confinement in squalid pens, perhaps even physical abuse. Yet what awaited them was something altogether disarming. Major John Whitaker, the same officer who had accepted their swords with only a nod, issued instructions with an almost bureaucratic calm. The Italians were to be disarmed, catalogued, and transported with dignity. Captain Ricci later noted in his diary, "We were lined in columns, counted like schoolboys, but there was no spit, no boot striking our shins, only the clatter of pencils on clipboards." The absence of cruelty was so alien that it unnerved them. One moment stood out, whispered among prisoners like gossip in the barracks. An Italian colonel, silver-haired and trembling, stumbled as he handed over his revolver, instead of seizing on the weakness. An American officer caught his arm, steadying him with a quiet, "Piano, piano." The word, borrowed from the colonel's own language, spread through the ranks like wildfire, that an enemy would use their tongue gently, not to curse, but to comfort, shattered an expectation drilled deep by years of propaganda. In the transport trucks that carried them north, the atmosphere remained thick with shame, but also a strange confusion. The Americans did not cheer their captives through jeers or laughter. Instead, The roads echoed with little more than engine hums and the faint shuffle of boots on wooden planks. One Italian lieutenant whispered to another, "Are we ghosts already? That they look through us?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Numbers again told the scale of the story. By the autumn of 1943, tens of thousands of Italians had already been processed by Allied forces, many from divisions shattered in North Africa. Yet what struck the officers most was not the statistics, but the details, the respectful silence of guards, the refusal to mock, the insistence on order rather than revenge, to men who had been conditioned to equate defeat with degradation. This calmness carried a force more destabilizing than insults. For a fleeting moment, many felt as if they still carried remnants of their honor, though detached from the empire that had collapsed around them. Their medals, though confiscated, were not tossed in dirt but logged and stored. Their names were written in careful ink, not reduced to numbers on a crude list. As the convoy pushed onward, one officer gazed out the slats of the truck at the Tunisian countryside. He later confessed to a comrade that he expected peasants to throw stones, to spit at the fallen. Instead, children waved at the passing column, not with malice, but with curiosity. The officers had no words. Defeat had stripped their banners and their illusions, but in the respectful silence of their captors. They discovered something far more unsettling, that the enemy saw them not as villains, but as men. The night closed in with engines rumbling, and the convoy vanished into the darkness, inside. The officers sat in silence, clutching fragments of dignity they thought forever lost. And in that silence, a question loomed: if honor could survive surrender. What else about their world had been built on lies? Arrival at the prison camps shattered another expectation. Many Italian officers, exhausted from days of transport, had braced themselves for filth and cruelty wire cages under the blazing sun. Rancid scraps thrown in tin bowls, the slow erosion of dignity. Instead, the gates opened onto something that looked, to their astonishment, almost like a small town. At Camp Hereford in Texas, for example, neat rows of wooden barracks stretched across the flatland, their roofs catching the southern light. There were kitchens, wash stations, and even makeshift chapels. A stunned silence filled the convoy as the Italians were led inside. Captain Luigi Ricci later wrote in his diary, "The beds had mattresses, the water was clean, we were given soap. For God's sake, soap! I had prepared myself to rot in shame, and yet here I was, lying on a bed cleaner than the one I had in Naples." Rations came next, and with them, disbelief, steaming trays of stew, bread still warm from ovens, and black coffee served in metal cups, hardly the punishment they had feared. American records later confirmed that POWs received nearly the same caloric intake as U.S. soldiers themselves, around 3,000 calories a day. Compared to the meager rations back in Italy, where civilians queued for hours for stale bread, the officers exchanged looks of both relief and unease. It was as if the enemy had decided to nourish their bodies precisely when their spirits were broken. Anecdotes circulated quickly, whispered in barracks after lights out. One officer had nervously asked if he could keep his uniform jacket, to his surprise. The American sergeant shrugged and said, "Keep it, winter's coming." Another recalled how guards allowed a group of prisoners to organize a soccer match on the dusty field, even cheering when a goal was scored, for men who had steeled themselves for degradation. These gestures were almost incomprehensible. Still, there was tension beneath the surface. The Italians could not shake the fear that this kindness was temporary, a facade before harsher measures began. Some refused to touch the food at first, suspecting poison. Others muttered about hidden motives: propaganda, manipulation, a trick to weaken their pride further. Yet as days turned into weeks, the routines proved steady, meals served at regular hours, medical inspections conducted with professionalism, and even opportunities to write censored letters home. The scale was undeniable. Across America, more than 50,000 Italian POWs were scattered in camps from Oklahoma to New Jersey. Each camp functioned with rules, guards, and schedules, but also with a surprising degree of humanity. For officers accustomed to Mussolini's prisons, where neglect and abuse were the norm, the contrast was staggering. One lieutenant remarked quietly, "I never thought I would be treated more like a man in the hands of my enemy than by my own country." The hum of evening bugles marked each day's end. From their bunks, the officers stared into the darkness, trying to reconcile what they had seen. The humiliation of surrender still gnawed at them. Yet each warm meal, each respectful nod from a guard, forced them to confront an unsettling truth. Perhaps their enemies were not the barbarians they had been taught to despise. Outside, the Texas wind carried the smell of earth and grass. Inside, Italian officers lay awake, wrestling with the paradox, dishonor in defeat, yet dignity preserved in captivity. The contrast grew sharper as weeks passed, for memories of home haunted the officers as much as their present reality comforted them. In Italy, they knew what captivity meant. Stories filtered back from Rome about prisoners left half-starved, crammed into damp cells, abandoned without medical care. Some recalled walking past makeshift camps where Yugoslav and Greek captives sat behind rusted wire, hollow-eyed and ignored by passing civilians. Better a bullet than a cage. One Italian lieutenant had once muttered during campaign days. Now, in Texas or in British-run compounds, they discovered that captivity under the Allies carried a different face. The dissonance struck hardest during small, ordinary moments. In Camp Atterbury, Indiana, officers were allowed to receive mail with censored stamps. Ricci noted in a letter, "They hand me paper and ink. The guard waits, not rushing me, as if my words still matter." To a man who had expected invisibility, the act of being permitted to communicate felt like a luxury. Another officer remembered watching an American medic treat an Italian sergeant's infected hand with careful attention. He later whispered to his bunkmate, "Would we have done the same for them?" The silence that followed was heavier than the desert heat. Statistical comparisons only deepened the shock. Italy's own prisons before 1943 averaged fewer than 1,500 calories per prisoner per day, while American camps consistently issued double malaria medication, scarce even for civilians back home, was distributed to POWs when outbreaks threatened the camp. Numbers that might have looked clinical on a report sheet translated into lived astonishment when a fever broke or a wound healed. Gossip, too, colored their perceptions. Officers whispered of how German prisoners in Italy had been beaten and spat on by locals. Yet here, a Sicilian captain was allowed to lead a small choir during Sunday Mass. Another time, when a shipment of blankets arrived short, American guards shared their own spares until supplies were corrected to the Italians. This was not merely procedure, it was an inversion of everything they thought they knew about victors and vanquished. And yet, guilt gnawed at them. To be treated so well by the enemy while comrades still fought and bled on the peninsula seemed a betrayal. Some tore up their letters after writing them, fearing their families would despise them for admitting comfort in an enemy camp. Others withdrew into silence, afraid that gratitude would reveal disloyalty. Ricci confessed in one midnight entry, "I eat well here, while my brother hides in the hills of Calabria. What right have I to this bread?" The paradox became impossible to ignore. In their homeland, where fascism promised strength, prisoners were often discarded. In America, where they expected revenge, even defeated officers were met with dignity. The old certainties cracked. If their own nation had failed to honor its word, and the enemy had extended humanity, then what did loyalty mean? The bugle called "lights out," echoing across rows of barracks. Men lay restless, staring at wooden ceilings, caught between shame for their defeat and bewilderment at the fairness of their captors. The silence inside those barracks was not merely exhaustion, it was the sound of beliefs beginning to collapse. If dignity in food and shelter was surprising, the real shock came in the smallest. Most intimate gestures, moments that could not be explained by regulations or rations. On a cold evening in 1944, an American guard noticed an Italian captain shivering in his bunk. Without a word, the guard slipped back into his own quarters and returned with a spare blanket. The fabric was thin, military issue. But for the officer who had braced himself for contempt, it felt heavier than gold. He later confided in his diary, "It was not the blanket that warmed me, but the realization that even an enemy saw me as a man worth covering." These acts multiplied. A private from Ohio shared his last cigarette with an Italian lieutenant, passing it across the wire in silence. Another time, when a shipment of Red Cross books arrived, guards made sure the officers received Italian language texts first. smiling as they watched prisoners rediscover Dante and Leopardi under the dim light of a single bulb. Such moments traveled through the camp like whispers of something greater than victory, proof that power did not require humiliation. What startled the Italians most was how uncalculated these gestures felt. They were not delivered as propaganda or grand announcements, but in passing, almost casual. A soldier offering a sip of coffee from his own tin cup. A medic adjusting a bandage with unexpected gentleness. Each act chipped away at years of indoctrination that painted Americans as crude materialists or violent aggressors. The officers found themselves talking in hushed tones late at night. Some admitted admiration. Others expressed suspicion. Perhaps this was all part of a campaign to erode their resolve. Yet the sincerity of the moments made cynicism difficult to sustain. In one barrack, arguments broke out over how to interpret the kindness. A colonel insisted, "They are softening us for propaganda," a younger lieutenant shot back. "Then why did that guard risk punishment to give me a second apple?" The silence that followed said more than debate could. Numbers only amplified the symbolism. By 1944, over 51,000 Italian POWs lived in the United States, scattered across more than 30 states. If even a fraction of those men had experienced such gestures, it meant tens of thousands of small mercies had been exchanged between supposed enemies. No speech from Mussolini or Goebbels could erase the power of those lived experiences. And here, dear viewers, a question for you: if you had been a soldier in that camp, whether victor or vanquished, would you have extended your hand in kindness, or would you have let bitterness rule the moment? Share your thoughts below. The lights dimmed across the camp each night, but inside the barracks, memory of those gestures glowed like embers. They whispered to one another, recalling cigarettes, blankets, apples, and nods, tokens of respect that proved more enduring than bayonets. Victory, they realized, could be expressed not in domination, but in humanity. By 1945, captivity had reshaped many Italian officers more profoundly than they ever anticipated. At first, they had clung to the idea that survival meant waiting in shame until repatriation. But the months of steady treatment, the daily routines, and the glimpses of another world wore down their defenses. For the first time, many officers encountered democracy not as an abstract enemy ideology, but as a lived reality. In the camps, they saw prisoners elected by their peers to organize daily chores or mediate disputes. A sergeant from Lombardy later admitted in a private letter, "We mocked democracy as chaos. But here, even in prison, it seems to function better than Mussolini's command." The irony was impossible to ignore. Exposure went further than politics. Work detachments sent some officers to farms in the American Midwest, where they picked cotton or harvested corn under supervision. There, they encountered African-American laborers and Jewish shopkeepers, people their fascist education had taught them to despise. Yet when a black farmhand passed water to a sweating Italian lieutenant, the gesture spoke louder than years of prejudice. Whispers spread in the barracks that one officer broke down in tears after realizing he had been cared for by a man his own government had considered less than human. The contrast with home remained stark. In letters smuggled back to Naples and Palermo, families described hunger, bombings, and political chaos. Mussolini's regime had crumbled, and Italy was split between fascist loyalists in the north and partisans fighting for liberation. For officers safely eating in American camps, guilt and reflection mingled. Some began sketching plans for a different Italy, one built, not on humiliation and hierarchy, but on respect. Statistics underscored the transformation. Nearly 90% of Italian POWs in U.S. camps signed voluntary labor contracts, choosing to work in agriculture or industry rather than idle in barracks. Many cited not coercion, but a desire to contribute, to learn, even to feel useful again. The numbers themselves told a story. More than 25 million man-days of labor were performed by Italian prisoners in America before their release. That scale of effort suggested not broken spirits, but men searching for meaning within captivity among the officers. Debates grew intense. Some feared returning home as softened men, stripped of their martial edge. Others argued that captivity had given them a glimpse of what Italy might become. Lieutenant Paolo Bianchi, who had once sworn by Mussolini, confided in his journal, "If this is the enemy's cruelty, then what name shall we give to our own leaders who let our children starve? And here, I ask you directly, do you think captivity can transform a person more deeply than war itself? Could being treated with unexpected kindness change an ideology built on hatred? I would love to hear your thoughts. Night after night, Italian officers stared at the American sky beyond the barbed wire. They had entered the camps convinced that defeat meant the end of honor. Yet many now sensed something different, that in the quiet dignity afforded by their captors, they had glimpsed a new definition of strength. When the war finally drew to a close in 1945, the gates of the American camps opened not with triumphal speeches, but with paperwork, transport schedules, and the long wait for ships. For the Italian officers, the moment of return was almost harder than the day of surrender. They had entered captivity burdened by shame, but they left it carrying something far more complex, a memory of dignity given by the very enemy they had once sworn to fight. Ships ferried them across the Atlantic, their decks crowded with men staring silently at the horizon. Captain Luigi Ricci, who had once trembled handing over his sword, scribbled in his final diary entry, "I leave not as I arrived. My country is broken, but my soul has been fed by strangers." That small leather diary, smuggled back to Italy, would later be read by his children as testimony of a paradoxical mercy. Back home, reality was brutal. Cities lay in rubble, families scavenged for bread, and the political map was torn between monarchists, fascist remnants, and partisans. Officers who had enjoyed clean barracks and steady meals now faced suspicion from neighbors who accused them of having lived too well among the enemy. The guilt returned like a shadow, but so too did the stories, around kitchen tables and in quiet taverns. These men whispered their memories of blankets shared, of apples handed across barbed wire, of an American officer who accepted a sword with silence instead of scorn. The gossip spread across villages, growing into something larger. "The Americans treated us like men," one officer told a priest in Naples. That single phrase traveled further than statistics, carried from lips to ears across a country desperate for models of humanity amid ruins. The officers, once symbols of Mussolini's ambition, became unlikely witnesses of a different kind of power, a power rooted not in domination, but in restraint. The numbers underscored the weight of their testimony. By the end of 1945, more than 425,000 Italian prisoners worldwide had been released, with tens of thousands carrying back tales of humane treatment in America. Their memories became quiet propaganda, not for Mussolini, nor for Churchill, but for a broader idea that dignity and victory could outlast weapons. One symbolic scene lingered in their minds. At Camp Hereford, before departure, American guards had allowed prisoners one last soccer match. Italians in faded uniforms kicked a ball across dusty ground while their captors stood at the sidelines. Cheering good plays, no speeches were given, no banners unfurled. Yet for the men boarding trains the next morning, that image of victors and vanquished united in the joy of a simple game remained etched more deeply than any battlefield memory. They returned to Italy not as triumphant officers, but as men who had seen the face of humanity in their defeat, and that memory, quiet but unshakable, became a legacy Americans could rightfully claim the victory of preserving dignity, even for those who surrendered in shame. The war had ended, but its shadows lingered long after the last ships carried prisoners back across the Atlantic. For the Italian officers who once bowed their heads in humiliation, captivity became a paradox, a place where dignity survived even as flags and empires crumbled. What began in silence at Cape Bon, with swords surrendered in shame, unfolded into a journey that revealed humanity in the most unlikely of places. The diaries and letters preserved from those years tell us not of grand victories or glorious campaigns, but of blankets quietly offered, cigarettes shared in silence, and respectful nods exchanged at the lowest point of a soldier's life. These fragments, small enough to vanish in the sweep of history, carried more power than speeches or slogans. They were lived proof that the measure of victory is not only in the size of armies, but in the depth of mercy shown to the fallen. Generations later, one can still picture the scenes, a Texas wind rustling over rows of barracks, a soccer ball bouncing across dusty ground, an officer staring at the night sky, wondering how kindness could emerge from war. These images remind us that history is not only written in treaties and battles, but also in the silent gestures between strangers who might otherwise have remained enemies. Perhaps this is why the legacy endures. America's triumph was not only in its production lines or battlefield strength, but in its refusal to strip prisoners of their humanity. The Italian officers returned home as reluctant messengers of this truth, carrying stories that would echo quietly through Europe. And so we are left with a lingering question in times of victory. Do we measure greatness by the power to crush, or by the choice to respect history? Whispered through these testimonies suggests the answer lies not in weapons, but in the dignity we extend to others, even in their defeat.